6 Tudor Queens. Katherine of Aragon, the True Queen. A Review. Part 1. Today I want to talk about the first book in the series 6 Tudor Queens. This book is Katherine of Aragon, the True Queen by Alison Weir. This video has been broken into 2 parts because it is so long. The second part of this review will come out next week. This video will be the first in a series covering Alison Weir's 6 Tudor Queen books and her other novels. I love her as an author, both of historical fiction and normal history books. When I first bought this book, I thought it was a normal history book and I bought it on Audible for white noise while I did university work. But I was pleasantly surprised to find out it was a historical novel. I love this book. I just finished my 4th read-through of it and it gets better every time. Every time I read it, the characters all get more depth. I have always had a deep affection and affinity for Katherine of Aragon because we both grew up in the south of Spain and we both moved to the UK on our own aged 16. I will always be an Anne Boleyn fangirl, but Katherine of Aragon is a very close second. The book starts with the young infanta of Spain, Catalina, sailing to England at 16 to marry Prince Arthur, the Prince of Wales, who she has been betrothed to since the age of 3. Prince Arthur is sick, however, and unable to consummate their marriage. She finds it hard to talk to him, as they have to speak either Latin or French, and she finds adjusting to the English weather very difficult. Catalina, now calling herself Catherine, suffers from homesickness, but takes comfort in her friend Maria de Salinas, and makes friends with Margaret Pole while at Ludlow Castle. She also makes friends with Queen Elizabeth of the House of York, but before she can settle into any sort of role, Prince Arthur dies, and she is suddenly uncertain of her future in England. She moves back to London and is unsure whether she will be sent back to Spain. Soon after this, Queen Elizabeth dies. Queen Elizabeth was Catherine's great champion, and she is left very adrift in a state of increasing poverty because Henry VII refuses to pay her allowance, because her father, King Ferdinand, refuses to pay her remaining dowry. She is in limbo. Catherine is batted about by both men as a political pawn. Henry VII tries to betroth her to himself, a thought that rightly disgusts poor young Catherine. Luckily, Catherine's mother Isabella refuses to contemplate such an idea, and failing to marry her himself, Henry VII betroths her to his son, Prince Henry, but refuses to let them spend any time together. And as the years go by, it becomes apparent to Catherine that Henry VII has no intention of letting his son marry her. During this period of years, Catherine sinks into a slight depression. The book covers this part of Catherine's life in great detail, for which I am very happy because there is a lot of intrigue going on. It is a very interesting time. I really liked meeting Friar Diego. He is such a sleazeball. But what I really loved about this book was finally getting to meet Catherine's sister, Juana la Loca. Though I wish the scenes with Juana were more detailed. I really love Juana. She is a person from history that completely fascinates me. If anyone is interested, there is an amazing Spanish movie called Mad Love about her life, which came out in 2001. It is available with English subtitles, but copies with subtitles are hard to find online. If you speak Spanish, I highly recommend it. I also really enjoyed the drama when Francesca de Cáceres marries the old banker, and the plot Doña Elvira cooked up to get Catherine to the Low Countries. They are all very enjoyable, and it was my first time hearing about them in great detail in this book. Henry VII eventually dies, and the 18-year-old Henry VIII swoops in to rescue the now pauper princess, and she falls head over heels in love with him. There is no doubting it. She even likes his high voice, which in the second book Anne describes as too high and girlish for such a large man. Katherine is smitten, and so is Henry, and they enjoy a golden few years. Very golden for Katherine, because at this point in the story, she still holds a large amount of sway over the young, naive Henry VIII. After the coronation, Katherine convinces Henry to join up with her father, King Ferdinand, to fight the French, with absolutely no benefit to England. Henry willingly goes along with it until he realizes Katherine has kind of been manipulating him. Not that she overly knew what she was doing, I think in some way she was just trying to help her father. Katherine's influence with Henry after about 4 years starts to wane, and that is when Wolsey steps into the fray and starts influencing Henry, much to Katherine's complete disgust, because he favours the French, and she thinks him overworldly for a priest. During the same period of 4 years, Katherine suffers a great many losses, 3 stillbirths, and 1 healthy prince who died soon after birth. She feels all these losses greatly, much more so than Henry, I think, and a phrase from the other Boleyn girl jumps to mind. It took the shine off her, in Henry's eyes at least, and part of his love died, and he started looking elsewhere for physical affection. This betrayal of their marriage vows completely tears Katherine apart, and she learns early on in their marriage not to confront him about his misconduct because it only makes him angry. So she is silent and she endures. What is worse though, like many women who have consecutive pregnancies, Katherine starts losing her once petite figure, and you can tell in the book she feels the loss of her waistline greatly, knowing that Henry preferred her body before she got pregnant, though he never says anything about it. When Katherine discovers that Henry has an illegitimate son with Bessie Blunt, it breaks her heart. She is very sad Henry betrayed their marriage vows, but more than anything, she is jealous of the other woman's child, wishing throughout the ennoblement ceremony that he was her son. Katherine lavishes love on her only surviving daughter Mary, and doesn't understand why Henry will not make her the official heir. She loses her last child shortly after birth, 7 years after Mary's birth, another daughter, named Isabella for Katherine's mother, and the entire scene is heartbreaking. Reading about Katherine holding the dead baby and crying while Henry tries to comfort her. Oh my god, it makes me want to cry. It is also very sad to get Katherine's POV when she is imagining her dead children around her playing, or when they are older looking in on her divorce. She describes them as tall red-haired sons around her, and sisters for Mary to gossip with. On to happier things though. The Field of Cloth of Gold is a great read. It was really nice seeing King Francis and Queen Claude, and I thought the friendship Katherine and Claude struck up was very sweet. Even with the newfound friendship, Katherine continues to hate the French. It is during this event that Katherine first spots the stylish maid, Anne Boleyn. I also really enjoyed all the scenes with Mary Tudor, the French Queen. I thought it was a very good portrayal of her, as most books show her as a little bit vapid and stupid. I also enjoyed the chapter where Margaret Tudor, the Queen of Scots, comes to visit. I thought the fact she complained constantly and got on Henry and Katherine's nerves very funny, and probably realistic, as Margaret seemed very headstrong. I thought this chapter, even though short, was much better than Philippa Gregory's 3 Sisters, 3 Queens, which covers the same period of history. The 2 meetings between Henry VIII, Katherine of Aragon, and Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who is Katherine's nephew, are also interesting reading. You really get the feel of family affection Katherine has for Charles, and I believe Charles cared for Katherine as his aunt. However, Katherine cannot help pointing out how ugly Charles is, and how he cannot properly close his mouth. She seems very shocked that he is the offspring of Philip the Handsome and her beautiful sister Juana. Katherine is extremely happy when her daughter Mary is betrothed to the Emperor, and she is very hurt when Charles breaks the betrothal, which angers Henry and pushes him back towards France. It is during this time of alliance between the Empire and England that Anne Boleyn returns to the English court. For 10 years, Katherine loathes and somewhat fears Cardinal Wolsey since he first appeared on the scene. He spies on her and continually supports France, which angers her. But she is safe in Henry's love. But apart from being unhappy at the loss of her children, she is somewhat content. She suspects Henry of having affairs, but is willingly blind about them, not wanting to investigate and cause herself pain and make Henry angry. Today is the second part of our 6 Tudor Queens, Katherine of Aragon, the True Queen review. The first video covered Katherine's teenage years, her marriage to Prince Arthur, her long wait to marry Henry, and the first 15 years of their marriage, the loss of her poor children. So, without further prevarication, let's get started. Katherine goes through the menopause in her late 30s, which is relatively early. She feels she has to tell Henry, and after she does, Henry refuses to sleep with her, which causes her great emotional pain. Henry starts to pursue a divorce, knowing he will have no more children by Katherine. Katherine finds out through her servants that Cardinal Wolsey has conveyed a secret meeting to see if the king's marriage is valid, but she does not take it very seriously. Then Henry tells Katherine he wants a divorce because he is scared of civil war after his death, because he has no sons. Katherine cannot wrap her head around this. She does not understand why her daughter Mary simply cannot be queen regnant in her own right. Katherine is also very upset by the grounds on which Henry is pursuing a divorce. She is deeply hurt by the idea that Henry thinks she has been lying to him about her marriage to Arthur for all this time. But the real dagger in Katherine's heart is the fact Henry wants to marry one of her maids of honour, Anne Boleyn, who is a commoner. The idea that a common woman's son would come before her own daughter in the line of succession is the real thing that sticks in Katherine's throat. It is during this time that Jane Seymour joins Katherine's household as a maid of honour. Katherine appeals her case to Rome, and the Pope sends a legate called Cardinal Campeggio to judge her case with Wolsey in England. The scene where Katherine addresses Henry in open court and makes her famous moving speech is very touching, and it was great getting a POV of her during this speech, when she thinks to herself, early on, that this appeal to Henry was a bad idea, but she is in public and cannot back down, so she keeps going, knowing that Henry is going to be very angry at her. I think during this time of the trial and afterwards during the appeal to Rome, Katherine becomes a little deluded. Katherine should have realized that the king wanted rid of her no matter what because he wanted an heir. This should have become very clear when the 2 cardinals suggest she enter a convent. Katherine didn't have to enter a convent, however. She could have simply agreed to the separation due to consanguinity like Eleanor of Aquitaine and Louis VII of France. This would have meant Princess Mary would have retained her place in the succession and her title. I feel also, with all the delays by the Pope, Katherine should have realized earlier on that the Emperor Charles, no matter how much he loved her as his aunt, was prepared to do very little to help her. I know Katherine was fighting for her daughter's rights, but I think her stubbornness did Mary far more harm than good, as if the marriage had been dissolved earlier, Mary would have kept her title of princess. Katherine realizes how much distress the divorce is causing Mary, but does nothing to stop it. She does try to shield her child, which is admirable, but never once realizes she holds the power to stop her child's worries by granting a divorce. But hindsight is always 20/20, and all I can really say is I do not have Katherine of Aragon's conviction. Henry moves Katherine to smaller and smaller palaces, further and further away from the court, and she is very out of touch with the political scene, and I feel this adds to her sense of delusion. Katherine doesn't even realize after Anne is crowned and pregnant that Henry will not return to her, no matter what the Pope rules. During this time, Henry starts dismissing Katherine's close friends like Maria Willoughby, and prevents Katherine seeing her daughter, which is very cruel because Katherine lives in fear of Mary being poisoned. The Act of Succession is brought in by Parliament to say that the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn is valid and Katherine is now to be known as the Princess Dowager, and that Mary is deprived of her title of Princess. The most importantly, Henry is head of the Church of England. This enrages Katherine, and she refuses to swear the oath, and there is a lot of fuss about her servants swearing the oath, but the servants do it in the end. The Spanish servants do a play on words, only swearing that they acknowledge the king has made himself head of the church. As a Spanish speaker, I found this amusing. During this time of oath-taking, Katherine does a horrible thing. She urges her teenage daughter Mary to seek martyrdom, instead of taking the oath, as she herself is doing. Katherine is heartbroken at this decision she has taken, but it is an appalling thing to urge a beloved child to do, and this action by Katherine is the only time in the 4 readings of this book I do not like her or agree with any of her decisions. Katherine refuses to let anyone call her by the title Princess Dowager, and sinks into a depression. She is separated from her daughter, her friends, and her husband. She is moved to a very dilapidated old castle, which is damp, and she becomes sick because of it. She sends a request to Henry to move her to a better house, but he refuses, and he sends the Duke of Suffolk to escort her to an even more dilapidated castle. Katherine refuses to go and locks herself in her bedroom for 2 weeks over Christmas. I know she was trying to make a point with this gesture, but honestly, I feel like she should have given in long before this point. She is acting like a teenager. During this time, the Duke of Suffolk is shocked by how old and thin Katherine looks, explaining the king is under the delusion that she is fighting fit and willing to make war on him, and that is why he is being so cruel. Katherine is still in touch with her ambassador Chapuis, while she is confined to this dilapidated castle, and he continually contrives to try and get her to get the emperor to declare war on England, and she refuses to do so, saying that she will not cause harm to any living creature, something that is very admirable given her circumstances. I don't know if I would have been as charitable as she. Henry gives in slightly and moves Katherine to a nicer palace, but because she will still not allow anybody to address her as the Princess Dowager, she is confined to only 2 rooms to avoid an ugly conversation with her castellans. It becomes very obvious in this part of the book she could make all her problems go away by simply giving in to the king's demands, and I admire her strength, keeping to her resolve not to give in. This woman had a backbone made of steel. Katherine starts suffering from bad heart palpitations and shortness of breath. She cannot exert herself in any way, but when she hears her daughter Mary is sick and perhaps close to death from poison, she goes on a letter-writing campaign, writing to Cromwell, Chapuis, and anyone she can think that might convince the king to let her go to her daughter. Henry still will not let her see Mary, so she sends her own doctor instead, leaving her without her primary physician even though she is unwell herself. Motherly love is very strong. Katherine may have had tunnel vision when it came to her divorce and the rightness of her cause, but there is no denying that she loved her daughter completely. Then comes Katherine's final summer, which is marked heavily by the tragedies of Bishop Fisher and Thomas More's execution. These affect her greatly, which is to be expected, and strike fear into her for the safety of Mary. She finally starts seeing the changes that have happened to Henry over the last 7 years, but still blames Anne for all of it. The fear that is generated by these executions make her heart palpitations much worse, and she collapses shortly before Christmas and takes to her bed. Katherine knows she is dying and is full of fear for who will care for her daughter and protect her when she is gone. She is happy to have her maids for company, but wishes Mary and Chapuis could visit her before she dies. She resigns herself to her fate, though. Then, shortly after Christmas, out of the blue, Chapuis arrives, and Katherine is overjoyed to see him. He eases her worries, telling her he will care for Mary. This is a very touching scene, because both people involved understand the gravity of it. I may not overly like Chapuis, as he was not an overly nice person. He was such a gossip and a warmonger, but he did truly care for Katherine and Mary. Then the most marvellous thing happens. Maria Willoughby turns up to be with Katherine on her deathbed, defying the king to comfort her best friend in her last hours. Everyone should have a friend like Maria Willoughby. Katherine makes her will and signs it as queen as a last act of defiance against Henry. But she still deeply loves him and writes him a letter telling him so. After this she feels at peace and receives the last rites, gently slipping into death. Her last thoughts are looking forward to seeing her parents and her brother and all the children she has lost. She sees young children and angels lifting their arms to her. It is a very poetic end, and I feel it apt because Katherine was so religious. I like to hope that she was reunited with her lost children. I am not a religious person, but it is comforting to think that she found some peace after enduring so much sorrow. I really love this book. I consider it a masterpiece of historical fiction, and I give it 10 out of 10, and I will probably reread it again in a few years for the 5th time. Mary's early life is idyllic, but is quickly marred by the breakdown of her betrothal to her cousin and the ennoblement of her half-brother Henry Fitzroy, followed quickly by Mary's own move to Ludlow Castle, away from her beloved mother. But Mary is a smart child who loves to learn and worships both her parents, reveling in the court's adoration of her, the only legitimate child. Even if her beloved mother, Katherine of Aragon, is getting sadder and sadder every time they see each other, and her father, Henry VIII, appears more short-tempered at every festive occasion. Slowly, Anne Boleyn's name is on people's lips, and Mary takes notice. Even when she overhears Lady Salisbury talking about the king's great matter, she doesn't understand what is happening or why Anne Boleyn is involved. But when Katherine of Aragon, her mother, sits Mary down to tell her that the king has doubts over her parents' marriage, Mary's foundation is shaken. She no longer sees her father in the same glorious light, especially because he is causing her beloved, devout mother, Katherine of Aragon, so much pain. Mary also doesn't understand why her father would want to marry Anne Boleyn, a commoner who isn't even royal, and her child's brain settles on the fact her father must have been bewitched. To her, at this point, it is the only logical explanation, but it is the first of many deep flights of fancy Mary will have throughout her life. Watching Katherine of Aragon, her beloved mother, become sadder and more depressed makes Mary very angry. She is angry at her father for being cruel. She is angry at Anne Boleyn, but most of all, she is enraged by the fact her father cannot see that she, Mary, could make a great queen, just like her grandmother, Isabella of Castile. Mary is in awe of how patient her mother is, especially after the court at Blackfriars doesn't make a decision either way. Mary is screaming on the inside and doesn't know how her mother has managed to stay so calm, deciding that this patience her mother shows is a sign of sainthood. I feel very sorry for Mary, as her mother is taken away from her, and then Lady Salisbury, her governess, is taken away from her. It's hard to read. She is just a teenage girl who needs her mother and her governess. However, I have been disappointed by the fact in this book so far there has been no Margaret Douglas. And I think Margaret Douglas and Mary spent a lot of their early teens together, did they not? And there is no Mary Tudor. There is no Frances Brandon. There is no family at all really in this book apart from Henry VIII and Katherine of Aragon, her parents. This is an odd choice by Alison Weir, but maybe we will get a short story where these characters are included. I am hoping for that. Mary's rebellion against her father is rooted in the fact he has hurt her, and when she is sent to the household to wait on Elizabeth, her baby half-sister, who she believes is a bastard and is treated cruelly by Lady Sheldon, it seems like overkill, this bad treatment of her. Mary blames Anne, not her father, though, and it seems like Mary has developed a get-out clause for Henry, so she can still love him by blaming every cruel thing he does on Anne, even if it was he himself who ordered it. It is completely normal for a child of divorce to hate their new step-parent, though, but Mary takes it one step further, believing Anne is a witch. Mary's hope to escape to the Empire and her cousin's dominions are so realistic for a young woman trapped in a horrible situation. She just wants to escape, and I think it was almost cruel of her mother, Katherine of Aragon, to deny her that hope of escape. Maybe if she had left for the Empire, she would have married and had children and never become Bloody Mary. When Mary's mother, Katherine of Aragon, dies, Mary goes into shock, with her health rapidly declining. I think Mary must be in some form of depression, or at least a stress and anxiety-induced illness. But cut off as she is from the world, word finally reaches her that Anne Boleyn is not in Henry's good graces, and this perks her up. Slowly, members of the court start reaching out to her, viewing her yet again as the only viable heir. When Anne Boleyn's fall happens, it is all very quick, and although Mary is over the moon about it all, it happens off-page. Mary's return to the good graces of her father, King Henry VIII, and the court is marred by the fact she has to sign a document claiming she is illegitimate, and this continues to haunt her throughout the rest of the book. But I don't think the signing of this document and the lead up to signing it was as focused on as it could have been. Mary's only real thoughts about this document are frustration and sadness. I think there should have been more dynastic questions at play. Mary's love for her little half-sister Elizabeth is tainted by the Mark Smeaton rumour, but at this point in the book it is not as prominent in her thoughts as I thought it would be. Mary's love for her little sister Elizabeth is also sad to read, because Mary really needs a family to complete her. She has an urge to recreate her idyllic childhood that she lost. Mary's relationship with her father and his new wife, Queen Jane Seymour, is finally on an even keel, but Mary feels awkward. Even after being restored to this succession, she is technically illegitimate, and no prince in Europe will want to marry her. Mary is the vision of spinsterhood, and Mary and Chapuis's relationship isn't really focused on in this book. I would have liked a little bit more of a spark, a little bit of flirtation, but there's nothing like that. I suppose it's quite realistic, but I would have liked a little bit of flirting. When Jane Seymour dies, giving birth to Edward, Mary's grief is real, because with the death of Jane dies any hopes of her being allowed to marry and have a family of her own. Mary is also growing very worried about her father, because in his grief he is getting fatter and fatter, and his black mood isn't lifting, while Cromwell is pushing Henry VIII to remarry again and have more children within weeks of Jane's death, and she thinks this is absurd. Cromwell is such a help to Mary that she starts to think that maybe Cromwell fancies her. And maybe Mary is right. He never remarried after his wife's death. Maybe Lord Cromwell had his eyes set on a princess, even if she was now considered illegitimate. Side note, I am super excited for the second season of Wolf Hall, The Mayor and the Light. Who isn't? When Cromwell eventually falls and is executed by Henry, Mary is genuinely sad for him. He was a big help to her. Anna of Cleves and Catherine Howard's rise and fall are very quick in this book. You hardly see them. Though Anna and Mary get on very well, I hope to see their friendship deepen throughout this book, and that didn't really happen, and I felt disappointed. Mary seems to think Catherine Howard is a spoilt idiot child, and that her father, Henry VIII, is a fool for her. But when Catherine Howard's fall comes, Mary feels very sympathetic, especially when Catherine is eventually put to death. Mary thinks her so young and so mistreated by the Howard family. I think there is a bit of "there for the grace of God go I," knowing how badly she was treated by her own family only a few years ago. This segment of the book is when Mary starts to worry about the rise of Protestantism and how it is affecting her younger siblings. Mary also is fully convinced now that Elizabeth is Mark Smeaton's child, even though there is no evidence for this, and Elizabeth looks more like their father Henry VIII than any of Henry's other children. When Mary voices her thoughts that Elizabeth is Smeaton's child, no one will even agree with her, and this is a real flight of fancy on Mary's part. When Mary's father Henry marries Catherine Parr, it smooths out all the family drama, and Mary and Elizabeth are restored to the succession, if not legitimated. However, this segment of the book really highlights how naive Mary is about the world around her and how much she lives in her own head. While being part of Catherine Parr's household, she never realizes that Catherine is Protestant or that the ladies surrounding the Queen are very Protestant. When the King, Henry VIII, dies, Mary is devastated. This is not something I was expecting. I imagined Mary would feel vindicated, that Henry will have to account to Katherine of Aragon in heaven, and that Mary would finally feel like he would get his comeuppance for what he did to herself and her mother. Mary is now living in Chelsea with the former Queen, Catherine Parr, but it's not as peaceful as it was when the king was still alive. Elizabeth is not a child anymore to be mothered and played with like a doll, and Catherine Parr is busy with Thomas Seymour. Not to mention the whole country is turning Protestant, and Mary feels out of place and put out in the cold. But Mary is Katherine of Aragon's daughter, and she is incredibly stubborn. At this point, Mary is very alone and decides to latch on to her faith because she has nothing and no one else, fighting the council and the king at every turn who are trying to outlaw her mass. The Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour scandal doesn't really affect Mary, but it makes her wonder about Elizabeth's personality and how much of Anne Boleyn will be in Elizabeth when she reaches maturity. Mary is sad when Queen Catherine Parr dies, and then Thomas and Edward Seymour are executed by their nephew, the king, but Mary is almost removed from all this drama. She is far more focused on her religion and keeping her mass than any of this court extended family drama. The chapter where Mary arranges with the emperor to escape to his dominions in Europe so that she won't be prosecuted for her Catholicism. Only for Mary to chicken out at the very last minute was hard to read, because I wanted to shake her and yell, "Just go! Get on the boat and go!" And the fact that she did chicken out like this means that the Emperor has taken the whole idea of her escape from England off the table, and that has made Mary's situation so much worse. Now, if she is prosecuted for her Catholicism, she has absolutely no escape plan. The stupid woman! No bravery there. Her mother and grandmother would be ashamed of her. The Dudleys' rise to power is very worrying for Mary, because Northumberland is far more determined than the Seymours ever were to make Mary give up her mass, and she really is feeling that she is fighting for her life, and that in a very short amount of time she is going to be accused of treason and thrown in the Tower very soon. The few instances where Mary meets Jane Grey are just awkward, and Jane comes off as a spoilt child, far too strong-willed for her own good. And doesn't that remind you of a teenage girl who was very strong-willed, that kept standing up to her father and putting herself in difficult situations because of her beliefs? But we don't get any comparison in Mary's head, and we don't get enough Jane Grey on page for my liking. I would have liked a bit of an innocent traitor crossover, but we haven't been getting any of that. When Mary finds out that her brother Edward is sick and dying, it is heart-wrenching to read, because Mary really does care about Edward, despite their religious differences. Mary's then flight from Warwick when she finds out that the king is dead shows some real determination. I wish Mary had been this proactive during the rest of her life, especially when it came to her escape to the Emperor's territories. She could have been married and had children by now. Very dynastically important if you are a Tudor. It all happens very fast. The people rally to Mary's call, and without her having to do very much, she is proclaimed queen, and she deserves it. I am happy for her. But this situation is all due to her brother's death, which means it is tinged with sadness for her, and this is something I wasn't expecting. It adds an extra layer of depth to her, and I really thought she would be triumphant at being able to restore the Catholic faith. Mary's meeting with Elizabeth on the way to London was so tender and sentimental, but Mary simply now sees too much of Anne Boleyn in her half-sister, and quickly cools towards Elizabeth. This cooling is fanned into suspicion by the new, good-looking Spanish ambassador, Renard, when Elizabeth won't attend Mass. Renard is using Mary's crush on him to his own ends and the progression of Spain's influence in England, and I hate him for it. There is no thought really given here to Jane Grey, and I was expecting Mary to be thinking about her a lot, but she really doesn't. All she keeps saying is that she won't execute Jane. Mary's coronation was not as elaborate as I thought it would be, but it was still a good read. Renard twisting his grudge up against Elizabeth on the run-up to the coronation was great, and then him making sure Mary knew that Elizabeth complained that her coronet was too heavy during the coronation was very manipulative. Good old courtier backbiting. Where would historical fiction be without it? There is, of course, the Wyatt and Courtenay rebellion, but I wasn't expecting much out of this plot. It was badly organised with no real objective, so I wasn't disappointed when reading it. Mary's speech in London was very moving when she won over the citizens, but I can't help wishing she was this decisive all the time. If she was this tough and strong, 24/7, history would be a very different place. The rebellion is squashed easily, and Jane Grey and Guilford Dudley are executed, and I was really hoping for Mary to be on the horns of indecision, but there really is no thought for Jane. There is no mention of Jane Grey's last-minute medical examination to try and save her by proving she is pregnant. The whole thing just seems downplayed, like Mary is giving no thought to this 16-year-old girl who is about to lose her life. Mary herself was in a similar situation not that long ago. Elizabeth's supposed treason drags on and on in the background of this book and is not as exciting as I hoped it would be, but the scene that is recounted to Mary of Elizabeth crying on the tower stairs was very good. Renard's hatred of Elizabeth is palpable, and I'm so surprised Mary doesn't see it, because his venom jumps right off the page. I highly dislike the man. Then Mary is married to the cold fish that is Philip of Spain, and my God, Mary looks for affection in every small tiny detail that he does. He shows her absolutely no affection, but he isn't cruel or unkind. He is completely delighted when Mary announces her pregnancy. I was hoping for a couple of juicy sex scenes between Mary and Philip, and I felt a tad let down when I compare this book to some of Alison Weir's other books. I don't want anything over the top, but I do want a little bit more than what was given to us in this book. As Mary's pregnancy progresses, Philip starts pushing for Elizabeth to be recognised as the legal heir, and Mary is very hurt by this, because she sees clearly that Philip is making plans in case she dies in childbed, and Mary is simply jealous of Elizabeth's youth and popularity, because now Mary is actually quite disliked by the general public because she has started burning heretics. As Mary enters her confinement, I lost interest in the book because I know it is all downhill from here, and the poor woman deserves some sort of real happiness. Mary's pain at not knowing why her stomach is deflating and labour hasn't started was hard to read, and Philip is so cruel to Mary about all of this, blaming her for not knowing what is going on with her body. But her pain only serves to make her more devout and more intense when it comes to rooting out heresy and burning heretics alive, because this will help her people. When Philip leaves Mary, she becomes pathetic, begging him to return home. It's not nice reading, because this woman is throwing herself repeatedly at a man and getting rejected. Who wants to read about that? The only way Philip will agree to return to Mary is if she enters his war, and against all her counsellors' advice, she does it. When Philip returns, it's only for long enough to get her pregnant again, she believes, and harangue her about getting Elizabeth married to one of his allies. Mary is desperately lonely, though surrounded by people. These last few pages took me ages to want to read, because Mary is ultimately so pathetic at this point in her life. It's sad to know that she dies surrounded by people, not connected to anyone, praying to God for a child that will never come, and signing warrants to have people burned alive on her deathbed, knowing in her heart that Elizabeth will make the country Protestant and undo what she sees as all her good work. I give this book 8 out of 10. I really enjoyed the first 3/4 of it, but once Mary married Philip, it was all downhill for her personally, mentally, and for her reign. A good read gives Mary Queen of Sorrow 4 out of 5, and I think this is probably a quite good depiction of her life in general, with the highs and the lows and the tragic end all mapped out. Like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, because I have tons of historical fiction content, as well as a full playlist of Alison Weir book reviews. You can also follow me on Instagram at Lady Jessica Riddell, and until next time, don't burn any heretics alive. Bye!